Oh hey guys, let's talk about the Sunfire cape effect, also known these days as the Bommy's Cinder effect. I got to work on this thing a couple years ago, and it was pretty fun. We changed it from your character actually being on fire, which kind of looked a little bit like you were getting hurt by fire, to something that was more like I'm emitting fire in an area of effect around me that's going to burn and do damage to enemies nearby. Now, because this is a persistent effect that basically goes on for the rest of the game after you buy it, and because it's in most every games that has any kind of tank that wants to get up in your face, we wanted the effect to feel fairly subdued, something that's just a quick read like, oh, that person has Sunfire cape, I'm going to steer clear of them, but not too far clear because sometimes I might want to come in and gank them, but you get the idea. It needs to feel like a moderately damaging fire effect. So there's a few different tricks on this that I want to talk about. First, talk about the parts that it's broken up into. We got the ground decal, which is this ring of fire on the ground, and then we've got the swirling effect that's coming out of the character. And you might think of these as indicating two parts. The first one is literally just a ground indicator. It's more like a user interface design, you know, kind of like the buttons that you're pushing down here at the bottom, that kind of stuff. It's meant to look a little more graphic and like designed shapes. And then you've got this, I'm going to rewind here a little bit. You've got this ring of flame, which is more of an in-world effect, like there's actual fire pouring off of your character. So we get the balance of both worlds. We get it feels like your character is actually shooting fire out from them, and then also there's a gameplay indication that you have an item that is fire related on your character. So I'm going to break this down. We're going to look at how we pulled this off. So we're using a mesh, and the mesh is shown right here. It's kind of a squished funnel shape, upside down funnel, and you can see it represented over here. Don't mind that there's triangles on this version and no triangles on this version. I basically, the game breaks up all of the squares that you see here into triangles by adding one more division. So just remember, they're basically the same shape. But the point is that we're using something called UVs. Now, the reason why it's called UVs is because the U is the horizontal axis and the V is the vertical axis. And I looked this one up, I'm like, what does UV stand for? It doesn't stand for anything. It's like X, Y, and Z, you know, the X axis, the Y axis, and the Z axis. It's like that, except they wanted a way to describe the axis on a texture on a three-dimensional mesh. So it's not quite an x-axis because the axis here actually wraps around this object, and this one here ramps up it. So x and y don't work, so they use u and v. I didn't know that until I did my homework. So do your homework, kids. Anyway, a good way to think of UVs, if you're still confused, which you very well might be, I understand. I've been confused many a time about how UVs work, is by thinking of a globe. You know that our Earth is round if you subscribe to what most people subscribe to, which is the idea that the Earth is indeed not flat. So with a round Earth, you've got latitude, latitude, and longitude lines. Yes, vertical and horizontal lines, right? Dividing up the Earth. And when you unwrap the map, the world, you get a map. Now you'll know on many maps the world is very distorted, right? Because if you unpeel an orange and try to like flatten it onto a piece of paper to like kind of map it to the paper, it's gonna like crack and rip, right? And that's what UVs are basically, is it's a flat representation of a three-dimensional object, just like a world map. And just like how Antarctica and Greenland are exaggeratedly huge and stretched way out because they're a part of the map that is not accurate, the latitude and longitude boxes are like enlarged quite a bit. The same thing can happen when you're working with a UV map. So this is my UV map right here. And you can see on my UV map, I've got a texture sliding down over it. like so. And this texture is corresponding. It's not quite moving at the same exact time, so don't try to look at it that way. It's corresponding to here, but it's basically sliding down, which is meaning that it's sliding out here. And you'll see that just like on that world map, I've got this texture here that's just these kind of oval-like shapes. You'll see how they get really stretched out here when they're at this part of the UVs, right? And then when they get down to here, they get really squished into circles when they're down here. That's because these latitude and longitude lines are stretched way up. So if you map it to this, it actually ends up squishing it down because they're just regular squares over here. If you don't understand now, that's okay. Just keep practicing with UVs and stretching and squashing and you get the idea. The point is that we're able to create interesting timing on this. So I can actually stretch out the animation of the texture and then squish it really small when it gets out here to the outer edge. So the end result, as you can see, is that it's moving quickly and then it's slowing down when it gets closer to the outer edge. That's just by manipulating the U, U's, and the V's, right? The texture actually is just the simple band of flame right here. It's really nothing more than that. But it feels like it's animating in an interesting way. Something else I did with the motion was I made a slight spiral on this. You can see I kind of like took it and twisted it. So again, if I twist the mesh in a spiral shape, but I leave the UV straight up and down, then when this guy slides down over it, I'll rewind it a little bit, it kind of spirals out. It has that slight spinning feeling to it, but the mesh itself is actually not spinning. So we'll go back to here. Sorry about that. One other thing I want to talk about here is the vertex color. You may have noticed when we were at this slide before that this mesh here is colored and this one is not. So in Maya, it's the 3D editing software that we use, you can select each one of these points individually and you can say, I want you to be this color. I can make it purple, I can make it green, whatever. In this case, I made them orange. And I also made them kind of transparent. So right here you can kind of see how it's fading out down here. I didn't show the colorized version of this because I had a hard time getting back to it. But you get the idea. In the game here, it's coloring each of these vertices gradually more and more until it gets to the edge, until it's really, really orange and really, really transparent. Which, when we go back over to here and we play that, you can see that the color, when it's up here, is like really kind of yellowish and stuff. Like it's like hot when it's closer to the character. And then as it slowly gets out here, it actually is turning more orange. Back up again. It's hotter white, and it gets down here, and it's turning orange. So I can also animate the color of something with vertex alpha and just sliding that texture over it. Some really powerful things you can do with meshes. Let's talk more about what you can do with meshes. All right, next up we got this guy. So I'll pause it here. Actually, that's a bad spot. I'll pause it there. Back it up. Perfect. Okay. So we've got this texture here. This is like a little graphic, really stylized kind of cartoony shape that we got going on. Cartoony shapes are great. The thing is, you got to think about the style of your game. Is your game purely cartoony though? Is it all really flat, dynamic graphic shapes? Or is it super hyper realistic? Or is it kind of like hand painted with some graphic shapes in there, but it's all textured? Like you look at these rocks and this grass in our environment, it has graphic shapes, but they also look like they're hand painted, right? So we want to mix. So this is a graphic shape here. It's got a glow around it. You can kind of subtly see the glow. In the next frame you'll see the glow a little better. But for the most part, it's just a flat shape with a very subtle gradient. It's more yellow out at the tip, and then it fades to be more transparent orange right here. Just like it's a very similar color palette to the previous one. And if I take this shape and I put it on this ring mesh right here, we're working with the mesh again. Remember the UVs, so the UVs on this are just straight across. When we wrap it around, we get this, and it's just one stretched out shape. It really doesn't work, right? It doesn't look at all like we wanted it to. But if I repeat it 3 times and wrap it around, then I get 3 distinct shapes, and they're kind of elongated versions of that. But it just takes these and basically stretches them out. Okay, so we got that moving around, but you might be wondering, well, where's all this other stuff going on? Because this over here does not look quite the same as this. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Oh yeah, this is first showing, if you take this ring and you unwrap it, this is, again, what I'm talking about, right? Like, imagine like the globe versus a map. It's like taking a mesh and doing this to it. And I'm just scrolling this guy across it side to side. There's all this other craziness going on. Like, you see how there's like transparency all through here and all of that jazz. We're going to talk about that. So first off, I'm taking off all that extra transparency. This has the glow. You can kind of see it's like black right here, and then there's this really, really subtle orange glow painted in. That's how you get the colors to really pop, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I don't know. It's that subtle touch that really adds a lot. Because here in the game you can see it feels like this fire is glowing because it has this really subtle orange around it, right? And I'm using an additive blend mode so that it really feels like it's lighting up the ground around it. Really nice. So we're just going to watch that scroll for a second because I recorded it scrolling. No, fast forward. Up. Okay. So here's where we start talking about texture multiplying. Now, I briefly mentioned this in a previous tutorial with the Mordekaiser tutorial, but I don't think it was a very good example of it because it wasn't very prominent what was happening. But the basic idea of multiplying textures together is I say, okay, on here, the white is fully opaque. It's like solid. And the black is fully transparent. And I take that transparency and combine it with this thing's transparency, and I move the two at different speeds. So they're both sliding sideways, right? But they're moving sideways at slightly different speeds. So you can see the decal, I'm going to rewind a little bit. The decal is moving a little bit faster, and you can see it in there moving along through those circles if you look closely. Well, if we take that circle texture and we instead replace it with like a hand-painted texture, like this guy, and if the texture loops from side to side, so basically coming off of this edge is the same over this edge and it just connects endlessly, I can just endlessly scroll that texture over and over again over the mesh, and if I combine that transparency with the really graphic shapes, I get this. So you have the really graphic shapes moving along, and then you get the hand-painted transparency sliding along it, multiplying with it, and then combine them together like that, and you put them in a little ring, and it gives it the feeling of ethereal flame in motion, but that the still graphic shapes are very graphic. They're graphic shapes. They're more like a item status effect as opposed to just purely flame. And so that is how it all comes together. I'm going to move my cursor off of that. So that's how it all comes together. So we've got all these elements working in concert with each other to achieve both the in-world flame and the decal flame on the ground. And we're using UVs on meshes. We're sliding textures over those meshes. We're sliding them at different speeds over those meshes. And we're using vertex color. We're using vertex alpha to make the mesh transparent and colored at different parts. And we're able to achieve a lot of interesting stuff with just 2 meshes. And that's how Balmy Cinder functions. So, hope you guys learned something. Maybe you can go and apply this to, I don't know, a game engine that you might be working in. You can, incorporate vertex alpha meshes with scrolling textures on those meshes, with multiplying textures together, to achieve some really cool stuff with just a couple of mesh effects. So that's it. Hope you guys liked it. Hope you learned something, and hope you have a good one.